For today's classic interview, we're going back to an interview I did back in January of 2013, 4 years ago, with Michael Parenti. And we talked about imperialism, we talked about media, we talked about class, and so many other issues that are feeling so relevant today under the Trump administration in ways that I could only imagine in a very hypothetical sense when I actually spoke to Michael Parenti back in 2013. So let's get into this interview from January of 2013 with Michael Parenti. Joining me is Michael Parenti, noted political scholar, also author of his latest book, The Face of Imperialism. Michael, it's really a pleasure to have you on the show today. I think a good place to start would be to talk about how media coverage and how it shapes political discourse has shifted over recent decades, maybe from where it was in the 50s, 60s, going to where we are today. How would you characterize the change and the effect of media on politics?
I think we should keep in mind that the major mainstream media are not independent players in the political game. They are not only close to corporate America, not only friendly to corporate America, they are a component of corporate America. I mean, they're giant corporations. On their boards of directors, there sit the CEOs of various different corporations, oil industry, auto industry, transportation, Monsanto, all these people. They actually sit on the boards of the big companies. A company like Fox is the personal instrument of a self-described radical conservative by the name of Rupert Murdoch, and they follow a very far-right view. So they reflect the people who own them. They serve the people who own them. In addition, they are influenced by the government that they're supposed to be critically reporting about. But the national security state, the U.S., the CIA, the FBI, they too have exercised influences as to what they'll put out to the media, how the media will cooperate with them when they ask them to kill a story, how reporters are aware that they can get frozen out if they say or they ask questions that are too disturbing at press conferences, for instance. They'll just be passed over. They'll get a reputation of asking troublesome or really critical questions. Well, then they don't get any responses. They don't get any stories. So the media we always think of how the media manipulates us, but the media themselves are manipulated by the powers that be. The big advertisers, anybody, I think it was Calvin Trillin who made the point that, and even the local media, state, municipal level, anybody who has any kind of serious economic power is someone you don't write critical stories about in your newspaper or on your radio station and such.
Well, I think it's interesting because when it comes to the American two-party political system, one of the best ways to avoid having a story covered by mainstream media is to have Democrats and Republicans essentially agree on it, right? And I think we see this so drastically with the issue of drones. Drones are something that George W. Bush exploded a lot of the drone policy. President Obama has essentially continued or grown it even further, and Mitt Romney would have done nothing different. And we basically have a mainstream media that almost does not discuss, at least in any critical way, the use of drone warfare and its legality.
That's correct. If anything, they apologize for the crimes of the drones. They say that war is war, and occasionally, it's unavoidable that occasionally an innocent person will get killed here or there. Well, in fact, they should more accurately report that over 90% of the drone victims are innocent civilians and small villages who couldn't even find the United States on a map, let alone be a mortal terrorist threat to us. So, in that sense, that's right. They are apologists for that sort of thing. The whole thing, the media often says that we cannot avoid, we don't intend to kill these people. Those are unintentional deaths, and that happens in wars. But there is in civil society, there's not just intention or unintentional. You can't just uh, uh, shoot into a crowd to kill one person and kill six others and say, oh, but I didn't intend to kill those other six. That was unintentional. There is another concept in criminal law, and that's liability, and even civil law. Liability is if you do things that are inevitably going to hurt other people, innocent people, you're liable for that. You know what you're doing. So if you drop a bomb saying I want to kill A, oh, but I have no intention of killing B, C, and D, then that's a poor defense. And yet I hear that kind of thing in the media. They're apologists for things like drones, and you're right. Both Republicans and Democrats take it, and the media dare not make a critical utterance of the kind I just made.
So the problem we basically have is if you have the two political parties agreeing on an issue, you're going to greatly diminish the amount of coverage it will get because it is not controversial or fiery in the eyes of corporate media. At the same time, if it falls into the other category, which is Democrats and Republicans disagree, the only lens through which it will be covered is through that of here is what Democrats think and here is what Republicans think, which is also not a particularly enlightening lens for interpreting the world, is it?
No, you're right, because the Republicans have a far right-wing position, and their view, even when many of their issues are accepted and gratified and followed by the White House and all that, they just keep pushing further and further right. And the further and more extreme right they go, the more they shift over the center of political gravity. So they take the far right, and the Democrats now, under someone like Obama, really have a right-center view. So what you have is the whole left wing, a whole other perspective or variety of perspectives on the left, which are just amputated and taken off, and you don't hear them in the media. And that is called objective coverage. The media thinks it's objective when they present the issues that are being mouthed by the political and economic leaders of the country. That's seen as objective.
And what you're really getting to, one of the issues you're alluding to here, I think, is that of just this real frank and honest discussions of the basics of the economic system that we have. And we saw, interestingly, with the entire Occupy movement, we saw that for the first time, really in a long time, as economist Richard Wolff has said on this program, a discussion of capitalism more broadly was all of a sudden existing. It was very, very limited, but phrases like income inequality were for the first time in a long time mentioned by politicians on both sides of the aisle as something real. So to that extent, were we right to be surprised that there was this injection of a new idea by Occupy? In other words, is it that missing from the political discussion?
Yes, I thought it was rather remarkable to hear, actually, to hear statements made critically about capitalism. But even there, the coverage was heavily slanted. The police were treated very favorably. The police got away with some terrible acts of violence and such, and these were not usually reported. We may have seen them on the internet, but they were not reported in the mainstream media. There was a systematic suppression of the Occupy movement. That movement came out of nowhere. I mean, you've got to hand it to the American people. They're pounded with a certain propaganda, a certain establishment viewpoint, yet they were able to come around that viewpoint and respond with some reality and say, look, that isn't what's happening. What we have today is 1% controlling the wealth and the well-being. And the growth in income has been monopolized by them over the last 20 years. Income inequality is worse than it ever was before. People are working harder and harder just to stay in the same place. If you're working harder and harder to stay in the same place, you're not staying in the same place. You're falling behind. And that sort of thing. And there was systemic critiques. There were critiques about people actually uttering the word capitalism as a whole system and questioning that system. Who does it really work for? At whose expense and the like? And what we need is some alternative public ownership of things, um, social programs, human services, greater protection of the environment. All of these things were coming out, and people were just talking about that, not to, not because the liberal media had brainwashed them. Quite the opposite. There's no liberal media. There's an establishment, mainstream corporate media. Uh, that's Fox invention, talking about the liberal media, meaning they're not always as reactionary as Fox is, but they're not really critical of things.
Certainly. The last thing I want to touch on is you've been critical of some self-described progressives who focus on race, gender, and culture as aspects that are informing both media coverage and politics in the U.S., and who have downplayed the importance of class and class power. You're being very clear about that here in this interview, but talk a little bit about how that is a criticism you've made of progressives, but also how they're not mutually exclusive. In other words, class and class power relate to gender and race as well.
Well, yes, for about the last 40 years, I would say, they've been talking about race and gender, but talking about them in a way that denies the reality of class as another component. And when they do talk about class, they talk about it as a sociological category, lifestyle, income level, education level, things like that. I say we should be talking about class as a social relationship. And that's what the Occupy movement did. They were saying there's 1% and there's 99%. They were actually talking about the great divide, the great class divide. That is, we're talking about how these groups relate to power and the means of power, the resources of power. The resources of power and the ownership and the wealth of the society are owned by one group, and the rest of us must find our way and try to work and earn a living and feed ourselves from hand to mouth. That struggle, that's a class power struggle, and that should be also looked at. And many people on the left do not look at that. They would also understand then that many of the race, and I'm not suggesting people ignore race, nor am I suggesting that race and gender oppression are not serious. They're life and death things. I mean, women are dying every day in the world, because I wrote a book called The Culture Struggle, and I talked about the global rape culture. I mean, throughout the world, I wrote about this several years ago, but I have descriptions of the stuff you hear happening in India today or Pakistan, the way women are treated and even physically destroyed because these maniacs and these fools are operating. So I don't want to say, and with race too, we may not have Jim Crow lynch mob rule anymore, but we still have an enormous number of black youth getting killed by police for very dubious reasons or by others. So those are very real issues. I'm not saying to brush that aside, but also there's a dimension of racism and a dimension of sexism that is linked to the class power relationship too. That is, by repressing people, having really depressed and repressed people who work for at a super exploitation level, you maximize profits tremendously with women and with blacks. You could see what makes them employable is their willingness to work for super exploitative wages. So sexism also feeds into the whole question of class and class power, and we really should really be looking at those issues, because that issue of class also determines the issues of empire. It also predetermines where our taxes and our money goes. It also explains why we have troops in about 60 different countries, why we have invaded and intruded upon other countries. It's to make the world safe for corporate America. And those issues are just ignored. And the phony issues that are presented to us is, we go into these countries because we are humanitarian and we are concerned that the people in this country are not doing too well. When George Herbert Walker Bush invaded Somalia, he said, I'm going there because there's a famine and I want to help them. When did he ever show any concern for famine in Africa? There were about 9 countries that were suffering famine, but Somalia they just discovered 3/4 of the country was rich with oil, um, and also that they had to make a presence in Central Asia and such. So, but that they can't tell that to the American people. They can't say, "Come on, we want to go bomb villages. We want to go kill these people because we want to take it over and increase the wealth for corporate America." Look at the French doing the same thing, Dave, right now in Niger and in Mali. Niger is one of the richest countries in the world. It has some of the greatest uranium storages. All that uranium has been going for a pittance, very cheaply, going to France. Niger is one of the very poorest countries. It's one of the richest and the poorest. Those countries that are rich in resources but weak, they get taken over and colonized and plundered. And Niger has been plundered by France. 75% of French electricity is nuclear. Unfortunately for all of us, because that's not safe. None of us are safe with that going on.
All
But
right.
that's an example of what I'm saying. How all of these kinds of things that are happening around the world, all this empire intruding, all of that is part of a class power that's being pursued and for class interest for that 1%. And that's never mentioned by the media. Who profits from all of these interventions?
Absolutely. We've been speaking with Michael Parenti, noted political scholar. The latest book is The Face of Imperialism. Michael, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. I'm sorry if I went on and on there for a minute.
No, it's I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you.